join us this morning. Pray that you be with him and help him to see his very thoughts for our education and learning. Help us to glorify you in the things we do by our lives, by our conduct, and our speech. Help us to be mindful of those who need our help. Be ready and willing to see opportunities all around us, Father, to advance those opportunities. Father, thank you for your Son and your Spirit. We love you and pray that you will be with us this morning. Yes, it's all in this day.
Well, good morning to each of you. It's good to see you again, at least most of you I've known in the past, if not all of you. But good to be here again, and if I can get this water cap off. I appreciate the invitation to come and spend some time studying the Scriptures with you. I want us in this first hour to talk about having the courage to continue in doing what we ought to be doing. That phrase comes from a very well-known quotation from Winston Churchill, who is reported to have said, "Success is not final, nor failure fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts." Well, Winston Churchill was not an inspired writer, but I believe what he said in that instance was true, certainly true and applicable in our lives in general. All of us understand the importance of keeping on. But if it's important in our lives in general, it is especially important in regard to our spiritual lives. And that's what I want to talk with you about for these next few minutes. Certainly, continuing, at least until the Lord comes or we pass from this life, continuing is an extremely important thing which we must discipline ourselves to do. And by continue, I simply mean continuing to do the things that are in front of us that need to be done. As long as our lives last in this world, there will always be something that needs to be done next. Some next step we need to take, some next task we need to cross off of our to-do list. There's always something that's up next and asking to be done. And our question always is, will I do that? Will I keep going rather than sit down and quit even making the effort? Certainly Satan's intent is to keep us from continuing. He would like to discourage us to the point where we just give up and we think, well, there's no point in doing the next thing. I've done enough, I'm tired, I don't feel well, and any number of other words that we might plug in there. But Satan wants us to buy into that kind of thinking and just quit even trying to do what we should do. But we must not let the devil have his will in the matter. We need to have I guess we'd say an animosity toward the devil that is such that we just refuse to let him put such a blockade in front of us that we cease trying to do what we ought to do. There are several passages in the book of Acts that I think make this point very well. I want to look with you at two or three. In Acts 11, verse 23, Acts 11, verse 23, when Barnabas had come to Antioch to see what was going on there. News had reached the ears of the brothers and sisters back down in Jerusalem that many people were coming to the Lord. The word was spreading far and wide. But many of those were not Jewish people. They were Gentiles. And it had been some time before that Peter had been sent to the household of Cornelius, and the first Gentile converts to the faith took place. But in Antioch, they were just going out into the neighborhood finding Gentiles to teach, and those that were obeying the gospel weren't being required to keep the law of Moses or anything like that. And so there were some questions the brethren down in Judea had about it, and they sent Barnabas to go check on it and bring them back a report. We don't know a great deal about Barnabas in the New Testament, but we do know that he was an encourager as well as an evangelist in his own right. And here in chapter 11, verse 23 in the book of Acts, it says, when he came and had seen the grace of God, he was glad and encouraged them all that with purpose of heart they should continue with the Lord. Barnabas was wise enough to know that as exciting as it might be for there to be this many new converts in Antioch, he understood that they were still in the part of the process where everything was new and exciting. They were glad to be a part of the enjoyment of a new life in Christ. But Barnabas knew that eventually the wear and tear would begin to set in. They would meet discouragements that perhaps they couldn't even see on the radar screen when they first obeyed the gospel. But it would get hard. And so Barnabas not only was wise enough in the things of the Lord to see that this was a good thing happening in Antioch, both with the Gentiles and the Jewish converts, but he knew that they needed to be exhorted to keep on being as faithful as they were at that point. If you turn over just a few pages in Acts to the 13th chapter, verse 43, when Paul and his companions were preaching in another city named Antioch, this one is Antioch in Pisidia, after some had turned to the Lord, Acts 11 verse 43 says, speaking to them, he persuaded them to continue in the grace of God. There's that word again, continue. Paul, as Barnabas had when he came to Antioch in Syria, Paul now in this even newer situation in Pisidian Antioch, knew that these new believers needed to have their eyes open to the fact that it was not going always to be easy to remain one of the Lord's disciples, and so he urged them to continue. One last verse from the book of Acts is over in chapter 14, verse 22. Acts 14, verse 22, where it says that Paul and his co-workers went back through all of the places where congregations had been established on his first missionary journey. And what did he do when they went back through these places where, again, there were new converts? Well, you may remember this verse. It says that they were strengthening the souls of the disciples, exhorting them to continue in the faith, saying, we must through many tribulations enter the kingdom of God. Paul was specific enough to tell these people that not only were they going to have hardships, they were going to be persecuted because they were Christians, and he exhorted them to continue and not give up. Well, that's just a sampling of passages. You may think of others that make a similar point. But I want you to think about the fact that whether we're talking about an individual or a local congregation, that encouragement to continue is always appropriate. Let's first of all think about individuals. We all understand that human life, if a person lives a fairly normal human lifespan, there are three stages to that. There is the time of youth, and there is energy and aspiration to what great things the person wants to accomplish in life, and preparation for what that work will entail. But then the prime of life takes the place of youth, and that's usually the longer section of life in which a person does what he has been preparing to do in youth. That's the time of life where a person is actively engaged in doing whatever his work may be. And in the Lord's work, that prime of life is the time when, for the most part, that's when we're going to make whatever contribution we're able to make to the Lord's work. But if a person lives long enough, there eventually comes old age. The days that Solomon, if he be the writer of Ecclesiastes, and I personally think that he is, he called them the difficult days. Remember Ecclesiastes 12, verse 1, where he said, "Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the difficult days come, when you say, I have no pleasure in them." So youth, the prime of life, and then the decline of life. If we live long enough, continuing is going to eventually be a difficult thing to do. And I don't know, each of what your circumstances in life may be, you may say, well, it's already got to be difficult, Gary. And I understand that. I get that. It's become difficult for me as well. But we need to have our eyes open to what the possibilities are here. That well before the time when we die or the Lord returns, whichever comes first, for most people, there's going to be some span of time, greater in some people's lives than others, but there will come that ending stage of life individually when that matter that we thought in youth was just a given. You know, what's the big deal about continuing? That's what we all are wanting to do. There come a time when that's not easy to do. Charles Spurgeon, a very well-known British preacher from many years ago, made this statement. He said, "You must watch, pray, and fight. Expect your last battle to be the most difficult, for the enemy's fiercest charge is reserved for the end of the day." Satan is plenty wise enough to wait until we are vulnerable before he unleashes his most fierce attack against us. And for many people, that fiercest attack from the devil to discourage them and cause them to quit, for many people that happens toward the end of life, not in youth, not in the prime of life, but the difficult days, as Solomon called them. Well, it's not given to us to know when the end of life is going to come. None of us knows how many years we've got stretching out in front of us. And I don't know about you, but I'm glad not to know how many years there are left. I'm glad to leave that in the Lord's hands and just try to stay busy until then. But until the end comes, whenever it may arrive, our assignment is to keep on going, whether it's easy or whether it's hard. But think about those three stages of life, not with respect to an individual, but a local congregation. Congregations have life cycles just as individuals do. None of the churches that we read about in the New Testament are still meeting today. All of them have passed out of existence, having at one time been a new congregation with new converts and all the excitement of that. Then the prime of that congregation's life, when most of what it will do in the Lord's work is done in that period. But as with individuals, so with congregations, it's true that the difficult days will almost always come, and that congregation will find itself on the downside of its life cycle, and that can be a very discouraging time for a congregation. It will become harder under those terms just to keep doing what we need to do. And we might fondly look back at the days when the work was new and there was all the excitement that goes along with anything that's a new project. But then the difficult days come when not only has it become difficult to continue, but we may have other brethren saying that we ought not to continue. Just disband, sell the building, and go worship some other place. Well, that's only a possibility in some places. I could tell you about a number of localities where a small congregation is struggling to hang on and to continue serving the Lord after many years in that community, but now they're down to just a small number, and maybe it's a long distance to the next faithful congregation, so just deciding to go worship elsewhere is not an option. In that situation, people just have to determine they're going to keep going and continue to do whatever they can do today, regardless of what tomorrow may bring, and to have the courage to continue. I believe courage is the right word to use here because it takes courage, generally speaking, to decide that we're not going to become discouraged. We're going to keep doing that next thing that's right in front of us. It is a choice we have to make to continue. And sometimes the decision to do that is not easy. You remember the phrase that is used back in the 26th chapter of Isaiah, I believe, verse 3, where the prophet said, speaking these words as a prayer unto God, "You will keep him in perfect peace whose mind is stayed on you, because he trusts in you." This person had stayed his mind on the Lord. I don't know about you, but that, to me, speaks of determination, a person making a conscious decision to keep trusting God when the easy thing to do might be to quit and not trust God as we ought to. We all need to have minds and hearts that are stayed upon the Lord, fixed on the Lord because we've chosen to fix our attention on Him. Approaching the end of life and the end of our sojourn as Christians in this world, there's a sense in which that's hard, but there is also a sense in which the closer we get to the goal, the easier it is. It can be both at the same time. But Paul said in Romans chapter 13 and verse 11 that our salvation is now nearer to us than when we first believed. Our salvation is nearer than when we first believed. That's energizing, isn't it? To know with every day that passes, we are one day closer to crossing the finish line. And so even if it is hard, physically perhaps, in the decline of our life to keep going, there is this thought that we are getting closer and closer to the goal. And in those difficult days, we're probably very close to the goal, relatively speaking. Down where I worship in Louisville, where the Paul Earnhardt is one of our members. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard him preach. Paul is, I believe, 92 or 93 right now. And he said in a sermon back several weeks ago, he said, people keep asking me, how are you going to do this thing of being a person who's in his 90s? And he said, I have no idea. I've never been here before. I'll just have to make it up as I go along. Oh, well, I think it's reasonable for a person at that age to think that they are very near the goal. Even in the most optimistic analysis of that situation would say that he and his wife are getting close to receiving that crown that they have always been working for through all of these years. So whether individually or congregationally, we've got to make the decision to keep doing the Lord's will. Individually, the difficulties of the Christian life are increasing, aren't they? I know I guess everybody who's ever lived in the world thought that their days were just the worst that the world had ever seen. And we're cautioned in the book of Ecclesiastes, again, to be careful about saying, why is it not as good now as it was in the former days. He says that's not a foolish inquiry, or that is a foolish inquiry. But there certainly are times when life has become difficult for a variety of reasons, and that's true individually. I think as individual Christians, we need to not think about the difficulty all the time, but I think we're naive if we don't think about it occasionally and make up our minds we're going to do what's right about it. But the same thing is true of congregations. When a congregation finds itself on that downward slope of the congregation's life cycle, things get harder. That used to be much easier. For one thing, the environment in which we try to carry out the Lord's instructions to go into all the world and make disciples, I believe I'm not just being a pessimist when I say that environment, that evangelistic environment, is becoming more difficult. But that's not an excuse for a congregation to quit any more than it is for an individual. In Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, these very familiar words are given to us. Hebrews, in general, was a letter written to brethren who seemed to have been thinking about quitting and going back to the life they had as Jewish people. In Hebrews chapter 12, at verse 1, the writer says, "Therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God." We're not thinking very carefully if we assume that just because Jesus was God in the flesh, that everything he had to do was easy. I think even a slight reading of the Gospels would indicate to us that Jesus knows a great deal more about difficulty than we do. And he's given here as our example. In the midst of difficulty, what did he do? Well, he looked beyond the difficulty to the reward, the joy that was on the other side of this suffering, and he made the choice not to quit, not to give up, but to keep going until he got through the difficulty and was experiencing the joy on the other side. But I think you see in that very well-known passage, once again, that it is a matter of decision. It's a choice that Jesus had to make every moment, to take the next step, to keep going forward, even though he knew that the end of his sojourn in this world was going to be horrible. He made the choice to do it. The Hebrew writer in another place says that he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. He learned consistently to say yes to the Lord's will, even when doing the right thing and the easy thing were not the same thing. To do it whether it's easy or not. You know, most people can do what they ought to do when the sun is shining and they have a great deal of strength and optimistic about the outcome. Most people can do what they ought to do. But it's in difficulty, when we are being tested, that we find out whether we really meant that confession of the Lord that we made just before we were baptized. That we've decided to keep the commitment that we made at that time, looking unto Jesus, who gave us an example of how that looks in real life. Just make the decision to keep on keeping on. In 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 13, one of my favorite passages, I think, Peter said, depending on what translation you're using, you may not see gird up the loins of your mind, but I think that was an apt translation, the King James translators. Therefore, gird up the loins of your mind, be sober, and rest your hope fully upon the grace that is to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Unfortunately, we live in a time where people tend to think of the Christian life as a life that is always meant to be easier and happier than what they had before they came to Christ. And we try to entice people to become Christians based upon the promise that you're going to love this. This is going to be easy. You'll be happier than you ever were before. And they won't, if that's the kind of preaching that they heard, that being a Christian is all about being happy in this world, they won't have been Christians very long before they find out that that's not always the way that it goes. They may feel like they were sold a bill of goods that didn't work out, and they may quit because they felt like their lives as Christians didn't unfold as they were led to believe that it would be before they became Christians. We certainly do need to rejoice. I think the word rejoice in its scriptural sense is something that can be done even in the midst of suffering. But happiness is another thing, isn't it? Happiness means that we like what is happening. What is happening around us is pleasant, and we wish it would just go on and on like this. But I'm here to tell you that being a Christian is not primarily about having a nice life in this world. It's about going to heaven. And along the way, the faithful Christian will enjoy some good things, some happy blessings that the unbeliever will never experience. But that's not what it's primarily about. We need to make up our mind that whether there's any icing on the cake or not, we're going to eat the cake with or without the icing. Let me use a homely illustration. When we became Christians, we need to have made an unconditional commitment to Christ that we will serve him faithfully and emulate his example of keeping our eyes fixed on the joy that's on the other side of the cross, and he can count on us to keep going no matter what. Whether it's easy or difficult, whether it's pleasant or unpleasant, that we will keep doing what we did when we decided to obey the gospel in the first place, and that is we made the choice to do the Lord's will, whether it was easy or whether it wasn't. I was remembering not too long ago the occasion when I obeyed the gospel. I was an early teenager at the time, and I've been thinking about it for some time, but I remember I reached the point at which I knew this is what I needed to do. But I kept procrastinating it, putting it off. Maybe it will be easier tomorrow than it is today. And I'm ashamed at how long it took me finally to do what I should have done long before that time. I just didn't have the courage to make the choice that I was being asked to make. And we need to do better, all of us do, than I did in putting off even my initial obedience to the gospel. We need to gird up the loins of our minds to be sober and rest our hope fully upon what? What is the thing that we are to fully set our hearts and our minds on? The joy that is to be brought to us, the grace that is to be brought to us at the revelation of Jesus Christ. And I hope we can do that and keep doing it. Many of you may have heard, or maybe at least some of you may have heard, this series of lessons called Reaching Forward that I used to do years ago, linked to the book that I wrote by the same title. And in the course of that series of lessons, I think almost every place I've ever preached those lessons, in the course of encouraging the audience to reach forward to the things that are ahead and not give up, I've made a public promise to a bunch of different congregations as I presented those lessons that I'm not going to give up. That I wanted to say it publicly in the hearing of other people who will hold me to it if they ever hear that I'm wavering in that faith. And I've made that promise often enough publicly that I think if the word ever got out that I was considering the possibility of becoming unfaithful to the Lord, my email box would fill up, my voicemail box would fill up. I would begin getting personal visits from people, all of whom would say, "Gary, you'd better not give up. I heard you make a public promise that you never would do such a thing." I think there is value in publicly committing ourselves to continue. One of the reasons we don't keep New Year's resolutions any more than we typically do is because we don't tell anybody about them. And so on about January 2nd or 3rd, we've already forgotten about what that resolution was calling upon us to do. But if we put ourselves publicly on record as saying, this is more than a whim, this is more than a mood that I'm in, I publicly commit myself to doing this or doing that, much greater chance of carrying through that commitment than if you were private about it and nobody would ever know that you made the commitment or that you rejected it. Peter said in 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, writing to Christians who were being persecuted, or at least were about to be persecuted, he wrote to strengthen their resolve to be persecuted, if that's what it takes, rather than to become unfaithful. And so in 2 Peter chapter 3 at verse 14, he said, "Therefore, beloved, looking forward to these things, be diligent to be found by him in peace, without spot and blameless. And consider that the long suffering of our Lord is salvation." It's an interesting way that he puts it, isn't it? That we need to give diligence to the idea of being found by the Lord when he returns, that he will find us continuing to do his will. He'll find us busy doing things that we are able to do. And he says, be diligent to make sure that happens. As I said, I personally am glad we don't know how much longer our lives will last in this world. If we did, if it was a long time in the future, we'd probably start taking a lot of things for granted and not giving the effort that we ought to. And then if it were coming very soon, we'd be terrified and not able to do very much. So maybe it's merciful that the Lord has withheld from us that information about how long the path will keep coming at us every day. When I said that this involves the matter of continuing to do the next thing, to me that's been a very important insight in my life. I think all of us realize that if we tried to take upon ourselves all of the difficulties that we ever would face between now and the end of our lives, we wouldn't be able to do it, would we? It's just too big. It seems so impossible. So we break that down. For one thing, we break it down into today's responsibilities, And Jesus said, take no thought for tomorrow. Tomorrow will care for itself. Do today's duties. But I'd suggest to you to break it down even smaller than today. What is the next thing that I need to do? What that would be would depend entirely on you, what your personal circumstances are, what your daily work routine is. 101 things are going to put something in front of you as the next thing you need to do that might not be the next thing that's on my agenda. But for all of us, continuing to be faithful to the Lord means that whatever is the next thing, we'll take that step. And you know as well as I do that when we look at it that way, the Lord supplies the ability to do the next thing, doesn't it? It's in the doing of a thing that the Lord supplies the wherewithal. If you think that you can pray some kind of prayer, that if the Lord answered it, you would have all of the strength and all of the resources that you're ever going to need for the rest of your life. But that's not the way the Lord works it. In our lives, the Lord does essentially the same thing that he did with the people of Israel in the wilderness when he gave them their manna one day at a time. And so I don't know what your tasks are or what mine will be 10 years from now, if any of us are still here by that time. But the Lord, whatever those tasks are, the Lord's not going to provide the resources and the ability to do those things until the task gets here. Meanwhile, there are things that need to be done today, and that's what the Lord will make it possible for us to do. And so, going back to Churchill's quotation, success is not final, failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts. Churchill, of course, was prime minister in England beginning in 1940 when the Nazis had taken Belgium and France, and it looked like England was going to be next. And so he is made prime minister with the challenge of somehow inspiring the British people to be courageous enough to keep doing what needed to be done. I can't imagine what it would have been like in those circumstances to look at the situation and to say, it's hopeless. We give up. We quit. We didn't sign on for this. To his credit, Churchill encouraged his fellow Englishmen and English women to accept the challenge that was being posed by the Nazi regime. But they had to do it one day at a time. And I don't know how this fits your lifestyle. I know very well how it fits my lifestyle. But I hope it will be encouraging to you. We're going to talk in the next lesson, the worship hour, about the process, the chain of events that takes place when sin is committed, and at every point in the chain as it unwinds, we've got a choice to make about whether we're going to let that continue or we're going to stop it right now. But that applies to this lesson as well, doesn't it? We all have the ability to make the choice to do what we know the Lord would want us to do. And so, don't worry about tomorrow. Keep working today. And both with individuals and with congregations, I think to a great extent we have to